Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kennedy has testified today that U.S. interests and values are at stake in Libya, and that the U.S. is better off because we went to Benghazi. Really? You think that after 10 years in Iraq and 11 years in Afghanistan, that our country, that the U.S. would have learned the consequences and the limits of interventionism? You would think that after trillions have been wasted on failed attempts at democracy building abroad while our infrastructure crumbles at home, Congress and the administration would re-examine priorities. Today we're engaging in a discussion about the security failures of Benghazi. There was a security failure. 4 Americans, including our ambassador, Ambassador Christopher Stevens, were killed. Their deaths are a national tragedy. My sympathy is with the families of those who were killed. There has to be accountability. I haven't heard that yet. We have an obligation to protect those who protect us. That's why this Congress needs to ask questions. The security situation did not happen overnight because of a decision made by someone at the State Department. We could talk about hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts for funding for embassy security over the last 2 years as a result of a blind pursuit of fiscal austerity. We could talk about whether it's prudent to rely so heavily on security contractors rather than our own military or State Department personnel. We could do a he said, she said about whether the State Department should have beefed up security at the embassy in Benghazi. But we owe it to the diplomatic corps, who serves our nation, to start at the beginning, and that's what I shall do. The security threats in Libya, including the unchecked extremist groups who are armed to the teeth, exist because our nation spurred on a civil war, destroying the security and stability of Libya. And, no one defends Gaddafi. Libya was not in a meltdown before the war. In 2003, Gaddafi reconciled with a community of nations by giving up his nation's pursuit of nuclear weapons. At the time, President Bush said Gaddafi's actions made our country and our world safer. Now, during the Arab Spring, uprisings across the Middle East occurred, and Gaddafi made ludicrous threats against Benghazi. Based on those verbal threats, we intervened, absent constitutional authority, I might add. We bombed Libya. We destroyed their army. We obliterated their police stations, lacking any civil authority. Armed brigade controlled security. Al-Qaeda expanded its presence. Weapons are everywhere. Thousands of shoulder-to-air missiles are on the loose. Our military intervention led to greater instability in Libya. Many of us, Democrats and Republicans alike, made that argument to try to stop the war. It's not surprising, given the inflated threat and the grandiose expectations inherent in our nation building in Libya, that the State Department was not able to adequately protect our diplomats from this predictable threat. It's not surprising, and it's also not acceptable. It's easy to blame someone else, like a civil servant at the State Department. We all know the game. It's harder to acknowledge that decades of American foreign policy have directly contributed to regional instability and the rise of armed militias around the world. It's even harder to acknowledge Congress's role in the failure to stop the war in Libya, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Pakistan, the war in Yemen, the war in Somalia, and who knows where else. It's harder to recognize Congress's role in a failure to stop the drone attacks that are still killing innocent civilians and strengthening radical elements abroad. We want to stop the attacks on our embassies? Let's stop trying to overthrow governments. This should not be a partisan issue. Let's avoid the hype. Let's look at the real situation here. Interventions do not make us safer. They do not protect our nation. They are themselves a threat to America. Now, Mr. Kennedy, I would like to ask you, is al-Qaeda more or less established in Libya since our involvement?
Mr. Kucinich, I will have to take that question for the record. I am not an intelligence expert.
Oh, you don't have the intelligence, you're saying. Well, I'm going to go on to the next question. The next question. Are Americans safer, Mr. Kennedy? Excuse me.
I think the other two may have an opinion also, if you wanted to ask them.
Well, I wanted to ask Ambassador Kennedy. Next question, Ambassador Kennedy. How many shoulder-to-air missiles are capable of shooting down civilian passenger airlines are still missing in Libya? And this happened since our intervention. Can you answer that question?
No, sir. I'll be glad to provide it for the record.
You're saying that you don't know?
I do not know, sir. It's not within my normal purview of operations at the State
Does
Department.
anyone else here know how many shoulder-to-air missiles that can shoot down civilian airliners are still loose in Libya? Does anyone know?
The figures that we were provided were fluid, but the rough approximation was between 10 and 20,000.
Okay, the gentleman's time has expired. Did you want them to answer anything about al-Qaeda growth?
If anyone there
If
knows
anyone
the
has
answer.
an answer on that one, they can answer, and then we'll
Yeah,
move on.
is al-Qaeda more or less established in Libya since our involvement?
Yes, sir. Their presence grows every day. They are certainly more established than we are.
Thank you. With that, we recognize the chairman of the subcommittee and